Hi, this is Misha, and we revisited the Suomi KP31, and so it seemed like it was only fitting to revisit another design from Aimo Lahti, the L35. We've done a video or two in the past, but it's been a while. Why not? It's a very unique handgun, and one of the first truly domestic Finnish designs. This is chambered for 9x19 parabellum, and it's quite the brick. We have a 4.7 inch barrel, and overall length is just a teensy hair under 9.5 inches. And we weigh nearly 3 pounds. Really 3 pounds once you fully load her up. So it is a steel pistol, and it's made from machined metal, and so you would think it would be very durable, but not necessarily. Now, also on the table, I brought out the Swedish version. It has its own video where we talk about Swedish service, but I thought it might be nice to put them side by side just to show some differences, since this is the much more common Lahti. This is the M40 version, made by Husqvarna. The Finnish versions were all made by VKT, which changed its name to Valmet after World War II. But before we get into it, I brought this critter right here. This is a Finnish military issue and refurbished Luger. Now, we have a video on Lugers, so I'm not going to go much into the history. I will just say that, like many nations, after World War I, Finland purchased Lugers from DWM in Weimar, Germany. They would originally be in 7.65 millimeter 30 caliber Luger, and designated as the M23. And they would serve well throughout the 20s. However, they weren't as reliable as Finland had hoped for. But more importantly, durability and ease of maintenance, field stripping, repair were more complicated than they'd hoped. And frankly, they weren't made in Finland, they were contracted out. So there was room for improvement. So in 1929, the Finnish Army, the FDF, the Finnish Defense Forces, basically said it would be nice to have a new handgun. It wasn't a major priority, but they said if someone can make a handgun that's more dependable, more durable than the Luger, also faster and easier to manufacture than the Luger, we would be interested. And that's where Lahti began. Actually, he had a prototype ready by the end of 1929, and he went through a multi-thousand round endurance test. I think it was around 5,000-6,000 rounds, and it did very well. But keep in mind, this was basically a handmade prototype that was perfected. His next prototype, though, the L31, which he tried to streamline for mass production, it didn't fare so well. A lot of the shortcuts and simplifications he made, it failed the endurance test. So he went back to the drawing board, and the next prototype was known as the L29-35. And the military would check it out, and in June of 1935, they would accept it with the proviso that a few things were corrected, mostly to do with durability, some manufacturing changes, and the trigger. They didn't like the trigger. They thought it was mushy. They also had some trouble with runaway automatic fire. The sear wouldn't always engage properly. So they basically said, well, we'll take it if you'll fix these things. And of course, Mr. Lahti said of course, and therefore soon some test pistols were delivered. 1936, it would be adopted. 37, they would place an initial order with VKT for 2,500 pistols for the Army, but really this never got delivered. They would deliver a couple of prototypes. By 1938, the military would have just under 100 really test pistols. These would be the so-called Zero series, and they were all a little bit different. One of the biggest changes, they went from, for example, wood grips to Bakelite, because the wood was swelling in the moisture. There was delay after delay, and it was really Lahti and the other engineers at VKT always trying to tinker the design, make it a little better, improve this and improve that. Now, interestingly, the FDF didn't give up. Instead, they actually canceled the first order for 2,500 and then placed a second order for 7,600. I guess they saw war on the horizon with Russia, so on and so forth. That's also where some of these guns would come from here. This was originally in 30 caliber Luger, but Tikakoski would make some 9mm barrels, which were a little bit longer, but a 5-incher. Front sight's also Tikakoski, and they would phosphate the metal. Some would also get these synthetic grips later. But they would rework some of their old Lugers to 9mm to keep them in service. Now, they didn't just have a program to refurbish all their Lugers to 9. They only wanted to rebarrel them if the original 30 caliber barrel was shot out. So they were still trying to use 7.65 in the FDF along 9mm. In fact, the Lahti pistol itself was originally designed in 9, but also with the idea that 30 cal might be necessary, 7.65. By 1939, though, they were just getting these things. They really still didn't have them quite in production. They were still tinkering, doing this and that. The idea was for VKT to deliver several hundred pistols a month. They really never met this goal. And by the time of the war with Russia, the Winter War in November of 39, the FDF had roughly 500 L35 pistols. And many of them were prototypes, or barely out of the prototype stage. So even though it was a model 1935 pistol, it really didn't see service in any numbers to speak of until 1940. Really until after the Winter War. Very few of these were in frontline service during that war. So let's look at this critter. Now this is a late production one, and I'll get into the different series in a bit. But what have we got here? Well, we are a very heavy steel pistol. We have a unique cocking system. It's kind of based on the Bergman, the 1910 a bit. It is a locked breech. It feeds using detachable mags. They're kind of Luger shaped. You really need a loading tool to comfortably load them, and the holster would have it. One thing they did get right with these, disassembly is extremely easy. You have a takedown lever there. That is it. Very modern style of takedown if you look at it. Here's our insides. As for our slide, here we go. You see our locking system here. This is our bolt. So our barrel, and you can either call it a slide or a barrel extension. I love the sound of the machine steel. Has a few interesting features. We have a loaded chamber indicator here. We also have the bolt accelerator, little, see that there? That was to press the bolt forward in the cold, in case it was acting sluggish and or the ammo was defective. our locking block you saw here. This goes up and down to lock things together. There's our bolt. Very standard looking. Our recoil spring, it does have a rod. It is supported. Just sits in there. So Lahti was very successful in that sense. Field strip, very good. Very large parts. Nothing to really get lost in the field. You see when I pull this locking block up, the bolt is locked. I let it drop. I can move it. So very successful in that sense. Sorry if I'm going slow, guys, but I'm sure you can understand my reasoning. These pistols are not common these days. Stop there. Did you stop? It's very smooth guns. Really are. So just to reassemble, you just pull it back on, and then once you're there, you can flip your takedown, catch back up, and there you go. And obviously it can't be rotated down when the bolt is forward. Mag release is heel style. The early original guns would have a stock lug here, although very few stocks are actually made. The safety is very interesting. When it's rotated into the on position, we have a single action trigger, by the way. Very typical. You very much feel it in the web of your hand, right here. When it's off, you know, rest more comfortably. Trigger is actually pretty good on these. It's pretty wide for use with winter gloves. May not be match grade, but it is at least better than some. We have fixed iron sights, ramped front, drift adjustable. Just basically a big chunky pistol. So despite production delays and current revisions, when the Finnish military tested these right on the eve of the Winter War against other guns such as the Colt 1911, the FN High Power, and a few other designs there, they still felt this was the best choice. Who knows how much was national pride, plus by this point they had invested a lot of time and money and energy into it. So the idea still was to have this be standard Finnish issue, replacing the Luger. As I said, there are only about 500, many of them still prototypes, in service when the Winter War happened. And this would lead from what collectors call Series 0 to Series 1. Series 1 would really begin with the Winter War. They would deliver about 1,000 pistols, give or take, during that war and immediately after. And then another 1,600 during the following year, wrapping up this production run in early summer, late spring of 1941. So Series 1 would have a total of about 2,600 pistols. Is one of the largest actual series. These had simplifications for manufacturing, but they still had a lot of lightning cuts and cosmetic flares. Next would be Series 2, which usually is what comes after 1. 2 would be about 1,000 pistols. They'd be produced during the second half of 1941 through 1942. Finland's little brief interlude of peace with Russia would end, the continuation war would start. So in 43, Series 3 would be undertaken. It would be about 2,000 pistols. They would try to streamline for mass production, eliminating machining steps, getting more pistols out. This is why there's about 2,000 pistols in Series 3. And they would run through basically the end of the Continuation War in 1944. By this point, the Finnish military had enough pistols. Even though they originally had ordered over 7,600, they had about 5,500 and they seemed reasonably content. So really, that was the end of VKT L35 production during this period, and it would lie dormant until the early 50s. A few guns were assembled from parts, I should say, in 45, just leftover parts, but there's nothing major. Series 4, which this is a member of, would be around 1952, and they would build a final batch of about 2,000 pistols, many using older parts, or for the commercial market in Finland, for the civilian market, and a few for export customers. Probably the biggest one that people think of is Israel. Several L35s were sent to Israel in the 50s. We don't really know how many. The low-end estimate's about 200, high-end's about 6. So they would receive a reasonable portion of Series 4. Now, Series 4 would be like Series 3, lacking the lightning cuts. But there'd be two major changes. One, instead of being marked VKT on the slide, now they'd be marked Valmet. Although the grips are still marked VKT. That's just what the mold was. The biggest change, the stock lug, would be deleted because they discovered that stocks were useless. And again, there was that eye towards the civilian market. I brought the Swede out. You can see it retains the stock lug, so this would have been like on the early original contract fins. Now this one, being a relatively early Series 4, still has the loaded chamber indicator. But later Series 4s, much like the Swedish gun here, would not. They would decide it was unnecessary and even could be a point for malfunction. It's just one extra mechanical part. So we'd have another 2,000 guns manufactured in this final run. This means the total number of L35s manufactured in Finland was 9,000 or less. Not exactly a big number, with again about 5,500 going straight to the military, another one going to police or civilians. Some were exported, not many, as I said, Israel. About 50 were actually sent to Sweden before they were getting their production up and running. About a dozen were sent to Switzerland. There had actually been quite a bit of arms trade with Switzerland and Finland for some time, so it's not really surprising. But that's about it. Now, interestingly, Sweden would pick up the design, manufacturing it at Husqvarna, and they would do one giant production run from about 41, very late 41, to about 46, and they would make about 82,000. So they took the design and made a lot more, nearly 10 to 1, 9 to 1 at least. Now, early Swede designs were quite similar to the Finns, although they got rid of the loaded chamber indicator very early. But then they would introduce other changes. For example, they would get rid of the stepping on the front sight, just going to a square. That's just to make machining easier. They added this nut to the end of the barrel to make barrel changes easier when the barrel was shot out. Sweden was always very concerned about having good barrels in their guns. They would add this ribbing to the top of the slide to cut down on glare. They would enlarge the trigger guard, the hole in the trigger guard for gloves. They would also make the guard itself much thicker. You can see. Yeah. They would also change the way the recoil springs was seated. You can see the end of it here. It's captive with the bolt. It's said that they got rid of the bolt accelerator, but this one still has it. And most all I've seen do, even very late ones. So I have to wonder if A, they got rid of it post-manufacture, just taking them out, or if they're confusing bolt accelerator with the loaded chamber indicator. But it seems like at least the majority of the Swedish guns would still retain that feature. The magazines are also the same. Different finish, but same style. And as you see, both have lanyard loops, although the Swedish one is a little bigger compared to the Finn. So you would think a gun this chunky, this heavy, this large would be pretty durable. But you also saw that locking block. It's relatively small. So it concentrates fire, all the stresses, in a relatively small area. Plus you have lots of holes. The accelerator introduces holes. The loaded chamber indicator. It really wasn't that durable of a gun. This combined with 9x19 ammunition loaded hot for the KP-31 submachine gun in Finland and the M37-39 in Sweden meant that they had problems with the slides cracking. Or I guess you could call it the barrel extension, you know, spit back here. As a result, VKT would manufacture, or I should say Valmet to be exact, guys, sorry, about 500 replacement slides for the military in the 50s, and then another 500 replacement slides in the 70s, and then a subcontractor would also make more replacement slides. So over 1,000 replacement slides for the 5,500, give or take, in the FDF were needed throughout the decades. Other small parts would continue to be made by Valmet through the 60s and 70s, although they were not manufacturing guns. The largest component they were doing were the slides. The last production run of L35s is quite famous. In 1985, Valmet would do a commemorative 50-year run of 100 guns. They were very expensive, although they were very nicely made. And that was the final run of Valmets. They were basically using leftover parts because by that point, 85, the L35 was going out of service in Finland. It was being replaced by the Browning BDA, and the guns that weren't already just inoperable were retired out. A similar story happened in Sweden, although a little more violently. They had some issues throughout the decades, but then there was a major one in 91, and they immediately pulled all of their M40s out of service, and this story is they melted them down. I don't know, toilet bowl hinges or handles or something. So even though so many were made in Sweden, unfortunately tens of thousands, really the bulk of production, were melted down. They refused to sell them on the civilian market. So today there aren't really that many more Swedish guns existing than there are Finnish. And of course they would keep some Lugers around through the 50s. This is a good example of a later refurb Luger because it has the later grip and mag. And so some Lugers would stay in FDF service through the 50s as well, supplementing the Lahtis. They might have other guns too. For example, the Walther PPK for pilots. They would also have some high powers in the Air Force. But this was a very uniquely Finnish gun. And I think they took a lot of national pride in it. It is heavy, of course, but quite ergonomic. And the parts move very smoothly. And it's just a neat piece of history and a very unique gun. A lot of people mistake it for a Luger, but as you've seen in this video, mechanically it has very, very little in common with it. But yeah, we just thought since we were revisiting Finnish guns, why not revisit the L35? It definitely saw more use in the continuation war. And it served alongside guns like the RK-62 in the 1960s. And really most weren't pulled out of service into the 80s and in some cases even the early 90s. And it is what it is. It was not a perfect design by any stretch of the imagination, but considering how young Finland was and how young its arms industry was at the time, you know, not at all a bad first effort for a service handgun. It could have been a lot worse. Well, we really appreciate you tuning in, especially our viewers in Finland. You've been very supportive of the channel for many years, and very interesting country you have there. I especially love your sense of humor. If you haven't already, please check out our other videos on Finnish guns. We have a number of them now. If you like the video, please click like, and if you'd like to help support the channel, please click on the link and check out our Patreon page. We appreciate each and every donation. $1 is great. If you can do more, that's awesome. If not, we completely understand. Whatever you can do to help support is great. Well, sorry this wasn't a more active video. I just really like the history of this gun, and I've had this one for many years, and it's one of my favorites in the collection just for being weird and cool. So I felt like talking about it today. I had my RK out for, or my, I should say M62 out for a different video, so it kind of had me in the mood. Hope you enjoyed it. And as always, this is Misha. And please tune in again next time for more hopefully interesting content. We'll catch you then. Definitely not a magwell funnel.